IVM.
$100. That's all it takes to begin your journey with Bitcoin and Ethereum. No, really. With CoinSwitch, you can start investing in over 100 cryptocurrencies with just 100 rupees. On top of that, there are zero charges for deposits and withdrawals, so you can trade, buy, sell, however and whenever you want. All of this, plus their extremely intuitive interface, makes CoinSwitch the perfect app for beginners in the crypto space. But don't take my word for it. Just download CoinSwitch for free and try it out for yourself. If you'd like more information on cryptocurrencies, tune into A Show About Crypto with me, Rohan Joshi, my new adventure on IVM podcasts. CoinSwitch, kuch to badlega.
Hello and welcome to the Wire Talks. I'm Sidharth Bhatia. In recent years, Indian history is being rewritten. Cities are being renamed, historical events are being reinterpreted, and old books are being discarded for portraying what is called distorted histories. Naturally, historians are aghast and are challenging this tendency to overwrite past history. But what does all of this mean in the larger sense? Does it mean like there is a campaign, or are these local assertions? Dilip Menon is a historian of modern India and a professor of South Asian history at the University of Witwatersrand in South Africa. He has been observing this for some time. He calls himself a historian who engages in writing and conceptualizing history beyond the map of India inherited from colonialism. According to him, what we know as India is the result of a mix of history from the Aryans to the Greeks to the Muslims, the movement of a diaspora of labor, merchants, and religious specialists from different parts of the world. He joins us today from South Africa to interpret the war upon history in India as she is being taught and learned for generations. Dilip Menon, welcome to the Wire Talks.
Thank you, Sidharth. Look forward to the conversation.
You're based far away, you're sitting far away, and though you are thoroughly engaged in what's happening in India and Indian history, but you must get a more clinical overview of what's happening here right now. What do you make of some of these recent events that I enumerated?
See, I don't know whether it's a clinical view because the further away one is from one's country, the more passionate one becomes about one's attachment. And this is the paradox by which I think a lot of the diaspora lives. As far as what is happening in India, I think what alarms me less are the attempts to rethink existing historical paradigms, existing ways of thinking about history, and more the ambience within which it is happening. So if one thinks about what's happening in India right now, what alarms and frightens me are the lynchings of Muslims and Dalits. What alarms and frightens me are the fact that everyday life is shot through with so much violence, particularly against certain groups, certain communities, that the value of certain human lives is considered less than the others. That's the ambience. So the act of writing and rewriting history has been with us ever since we started to reckon with an idea of the past and how it influences the present. So I don't think the renaming of cities or the fact that an earlier paradigm of thinking about history is slowly changing worries me all that much. It's the trajectory of that as well as the context of it that worries me more.
No, that's true, Dilip, when you, in a sense, look at the relative importance of what's happening all over India and the casualness with which this is happening. But they're one of a piece, isn't it? I mean, this is a kind of violence against history as we know it, and that is violence against real human beings. But they're all linked, because how do you justify killing of or lynching of a Muslim or anyone else if you don't provide some kind of overarching or even micro reason for doing it? So can one just ignore this part?
No, I think you're posing the argument in rather extreme ways, so I'll have to agree with you. We can't ignore it, certainly. But I'm trying to step back from this because obviously we're all reading the newspapers. There's been a lot of writing ranging from some of the stalwarts of the historical profession, Irfan Habib, Ramila Thapar, right down to younger historians, as well as articles in the newspapers on this issue. So I don't want to add to that. I mean, there's very little that one can add to that. We speak from the same side of the political divide. We speak with a certain vision of India that we share, that's you and I. So I'm just trying to have a conversation in which I step back from some of this, from the fray, as it were. So if one thinks about, the rewriting of history in a much broader sense, I mean, it's interesting that the idea of 1857, for example, as the first war of national independence, was put forward by Vinayak Damodar Savarkar. Right? He was the first person to articulate a position which said that 1857 was the first war to actually free India from the British. Now, historians subsequently have been very skeptical about this. In fact, it could even be argued that the mutiny, that it was actually a mutiny within the Bengal army, which spread. It happened largely within the old Indo-Gangetic and Mughal heartland. Central India was certainly involved. The Madras Presidency armies and the Bombay Presidency armies were not involved in the mutiny. Right? So if one were to put forward such a position, both left nationalist historians as well as right nationalist historians would worry about this, because I think we are all deeply invested as historians of a nation and also as nationalist historians in the idea that there was a trajectory of resistance. Right? So 1757, institution of British rule or East India Company rule, and 1857 was the first explosion, and 1947 was the next explosion. Right? So I think this question of writing and rewriting of history is something that we are engaging in a field where there are positions which are left nationalist, there are positions which are right nationalist, there are positions which are secular, and so on. And all of them have some purchase on the idea of truth. But not all of them are absolutely true representations. And so to take you back, if you'll allow me, to take you back to the 1980s when I was an undergraduate student, and subaltern studies came to the fore in the writing of Indian history, people like Ranajit Guha, Dipesh Chakravarti, Gyan Pandey, and so on and so forth. It was interesting that the position put forward by the subaltern studies that there are two streams within nationalism. There is elite nationalism, which had really been the landscape within which an earlier nationalist history was written, and that we needed to look at. And a parallel stream was subaltern nationalism, that there was a lot of autonomy, peasants, tribals fought for their rights and so on, and this certainly couldn't be folded back into a history of nationalism. And the historian Gyan Pandey at that point argued that wherever the Indian National Congress was strong, popular militancy was weak. Right? That the Indian National Congress actually tried to corral popular militancy. One would have thought that this is a perfectly acute historical view, but this was opposed by historians within the secular left liberal paradigm. Right? So there was this war that broke out between the Delhi University historians and the historians at Jawaharlal Nehru University, where people argued that, hey, all of this talk of subaltern agency doesn't reflect the kind of organization that went into the nationalist movement, that there was a consistent and coherent ideology of nationalism and so on. So I think there are all of these affrays happening, but they were happening within a space within which debates were allowed. They were happening in a space where the social media was absent, right? So when we talk about the situation right now, we are talking about a kind of aggravation plus, as it were. These historical debates have been going on for a while. It's just that the circles of dissent, circles of engagement have been smaller. Now, as they say, everybody and their first cousin has an opinion on everything. And that is another thing to be talked about.
That actually brings me to what I was going to say, Dilip, that, social media is definitely an amplifier and allows all kinds of opinion. I would say in a very kind of tangential sense, it is a public opinion of a public that has a voice. So, how do we express public opinion. So, but when you have somebody like Ram Madhav, who's a leading light of the RSS, saying the Mopla revolution was a product of a Talibanized mind, and this takes me back to what I just told you, that these things are linked, or when you say that we are going to change the name of Allahabad and so many other places, one by one, swiftly, and I'm not trying to continue to reestablish that point, but somehow I feel that this is all part of a stream where you attack at different levels, from the constitutional legal changes to the lynching and much in between.
Well, you're right there. And I think this process of renaming, there's a whole space of popular memory and everyday interaction. Then there are the actions of the state and the actions of political parties. So growing up in Delhi, there was Curzon Road, which was at the heart of the city. It was renamed Kasturba Gandhi Marg. And my generation, at least, never really engaged with the fact that it was Kasturba Gandhi Marg. You got into a bus or you got into an auto rickshaw and you asked for Curzon Road, because nobody knew what this was. Similarly, when you think about the change of names of Calcutta to Kolkata or Bombay to Mumbai, people continue to interchangeably use the two, right, in conversation. And it's not just a question of generation, right? It's not just an older generation sentimentally and nostalgically invokes the idea of Bombay or makes a theoretical difference between the Bombay of Nissim Ezekiel and the Mumbai of the Thackeray's and so on, that these continue to coexist. And I think in terms of the changes of names of cities, this is going to be with us, that we're going to get these layers. The multiple names are going to persist. Different people are going to invoke these different names. And I suspect that this is not going to be just a matter of the present and of present memory, that this will continue. Because one tends to give too much importance to the state in the private and personal life of people. States are what they are. They are possessed of hubris. They draw lines in the dust, create maps, they generate wars. But there is a whole sense of everyday living and everyday community and everyday memory that exists alongside this, right? And it's not to invoke the old Matthew Arnold image of the peasants bending before the flow of the barbarian invasions and then standing up again. That's not. I'm not being sentimental here. I'm saying that we need to pay attention to the texture of people's lives, the texture of people's memory, rather than just paying attention to what the state does. The state does what it does, and every state is brutal, right? If we think about the state that preceded, if you think about those years of Congress rule, anyone who's read David Selburn's wonderful book written just after the emergency, it's chilling to read. At the levels of violence in our society, whether it's caste or class or impunity. Right? And there's this historian and feminist V. Geeta uses this word to characterize political and social life in India, impunity. We have something called the rule of law, but basically, no one's life is held sacred. Some lives are held sacred and others are not. And we know how those fault lines work.
You're right that public memory and public perception continues the way it has always been, though over time certain names, old names drop off and new names take over. For example, in Bombay or Mumbai, if you say Kala Goda, every cabbie knows it.
Right.
But the name was changed long ago and there is no Goda.
Yes.
Or if you say Flora Fountain, they will take you to Flora Fountain. But a lot of old-timers don't know Hutatma Chowk, and a lot of youngsters may or may not know Flora Fountain. May or may not.
Right.
I mean, VT Station is a classic example. It's called CST, but that name has caught on somehow.
Right.
So, yes, one doesn't have to be sentimental, though a little bit of nostalgia is always welcome. But therefore, again, I would like to advance this argument that sometimes things done by force or by fiat do change things, because our physical memory of Rajpath is going to be destroyed and the central vista will be right in front of us. So it's not a name change, which is just official,
right,
but it is also a physical imposition which erases, wipes out a past that was with us till last year or the year before.
No, I agree. See, there is, again, but one must put it against a history of such erasures that have been happening in Delhi in the colonial period as well as independence period. So if one were to think about how many people, whether on the left or the right, remember or think about what was called slum clearance in Delhi during the emergency, the Turkman Gate massacre, right? Not many people know about this. It was an attempt to clean up Delhi. The idea was that, look, there were the wrong kinds of people living in areas that were probably prime real estate and needed to be appropriated. And even here, while this is an act of what we have here in the recreation of what is now called the Central Vista, this is an act that is, in some sense, an attempt to wipe out the memory of Lynchings Delhi. That nomenclature that is the bugbear of the Hindu right and of the Hindu fundamentalists.
Which, of course, signifies elite English-speaking people who form their own small universe and think that they hold the cultural capital of the country.
So yeah, which is probably both true and not true, because India has never been a democratic society. India has been a place that has been dominated by elites of various kinds. So in Delhi, the bureaucratic elite had access and power, which was of significant nature. But that's all other questions for a much longer conversation. Now, this question of the revamping that's happening here, a lot of the buildings were up for renovation. What really happened was conjunctural as well as ideological. That a lot of discussions that could have been held about the renovation of many of those buildings that needed to be renovated. Some of them are built in the 80s, some of them were built much earlier, right? And one needed to ask the question whether they needed to be demolished, whether they needed refurbishment, what was to be the central plan. Is Lutjens's idea of Delhi so sacred to independent India that, that we worship Edwin Lutyens like our ancestor and his plans are laid in stone? What are the erasures that happened when Lutjens's Delhi was built, right? Because if you think about post-1857 Delhi, there are ways in which this urban space of post-1857 Delhi was configured in such a way as to create separations of various kinds. And Lutjens's Delhi did very much that. It built upon that trajectory. So I think it also allows us to revisit some of these issues. This is not to say that I think that what is happening right now, where there's the whole-scale demolition that's happening and a rebuilding that's happening, and possibly large amounts of money are being spent in acts of patronage and cronyism and so on. All of that is out there in the open, and we're all agitated and angry about it. But the question of urban planning and the question of buildings, I think we need to think about more seriously as to what is it that states and governments from the colonial to the post-colonial government have done in Delhi, and what this represents, right? And what the BJP is doing right now represents. There is a long pedigree to this, unfortunately, which we need to think about.
You mentioned clearance of the Turkman gates. I've just read Christophe Jaffrelot's book on the emergency.
Right.
And he's done detailed work. That's one of the highlights of the book. I mean, I have a lot of problems with the book, and I was just in my first job when the emergency was going on. So I've seen some of it from Bombay, and a few of my friends disappeared. And so one remembers that as much as one can. But yes, what Sanjay Gandhi did with the active connivance and help of Jagmohan, who later on went to become BJP and Kashmir, is being replicated today. And that can never be a justification. So therefore, there is a pedigree that can never be a justification in a sense. Not that you're trying to justify, but you're saying these things happen. And Lutyens and his ilk also impose their will on the Indian subjects. Look at Jallianwala Bagh.
Yes.
And that's exercised the people of Amritsar like nothing else.
Mm-hmm.
So as always, maybe nothing will come out of it. It's a done deal. I spoke to a senior retired civil servant who had worked in Amritsar, and he said, what hurt us the most was the designers who came there and, looked around and said, let's do this. And not one local resident or expert or the association of whose parents or uncles and aunts were killed, there is an association. Not one of them was consulted.
Right.
Well, they could have easily done this. It's a small city and they could have easily done it.
Right.
And they have, he kind of wanted to use the word, but somebody else has Disneyfied it.
Mm-hmm.
So, I'm afraid maybe sitting here, I'm getting a slightly more up-close, distorted picture. But it's some of these things, you're right when you say that the ambience is the context is critical.
Right.
But the context and this are invariably and inevitably linked.
No, Sidharth, we are in agreement on this. If you see, there are many ways of speaking about this. And as we discussed prior to, at the beginning of our conversation, I could be in one voice with you in condemning all of this, right? And this is something that is close to my heart as an Indian, close to my heart as an Indian of a certain generation, right? Having grown up with a certain sense of values, which I realized were the values of a limited space that I occupied, right? 1992, when Babri Masjid was destroyed, a lot of us were shocked. And that was the shock of a generation that knew nothing of India, right? That suddenly realized that there were many things happening which they were cocooned from, were ignorant of, were willfully ignorant of, or sometimes sadly ignorant of. So when you come to something like talking about whether it's Lutyens or Jallianwala Bagh, yes, I completely agree with you that there should have been consultations, that there should have been people who were involved in the struggle, descendants of those who were killed at Jallianwala Bagh who should have been consulted. But in the end, states and organizations take the decisions that they do, right? I mean, so aesthetically, while it's displeasing to me, right? And I know that my dear friend, Nadeem Suri, who is the Consul General here and at Johannesburg, was a dear friend who wrote a wonderful article about what was happening in the kind of the vulgar aesthetic, so to speak. There is a question that has to be raised. I mean, each state produces its own aesthetics. So when one thinks about the Akshardham temple that was built in Delhi, I never visited it, right? I found it a monstrosity. I found it, again, to use your word, a Hindu Disney artifact. But there are huge numbers of people who go to it. Right? So these questions of aesthetics are also subjective. But in this particular case, this was violence done to a certain memory of martyrdom. Right? So, but alongside that question, there's the larger question of a changing aesthetic. Right? Just as much as if you were to build buildings right now in Delhi, they're not going to be built in red sandstone in imperial fashion. They're going to reflect another kind of aesthetic view. So this is not, again, to justify. I'm just trying to think beside you, because we are of the same view in this. We are of the same opinion. And the conversation would be less than interesting if you were to basically sit around like old men in a coffee house and say, alas, the world is falling down around our ears. Right? So I think...
Trust me, that has its moments, but go ahead.
And so for me, the question has been how to engage with my agitation and my sense of despondency, gloom, and anger, and also to engage with the violence that is happening in India right now. And that violence is at the level of physical violence, it's at the level of what academics call epistemic violence, an attack on certain forms of knowledge. So for me, the question is, how do I think through this, not from the limited paradigm that I occupy? How do we create a conversation between paradigms? And in 1992, when Babri Masjid happened, one of the first things that I was involved in, along with a lot of friends in Delhi, was going to schools and talking to students and finding out what the destruction of Babri Masjid meant to them. And for me, one of the biggest shocks was actually to talk about Gandhi, to talk about the dream that Gandhi had for India, and to discover that it meant nothing to that generation of school students who saw Gandhi as a dreamer. For us, when we use the word dream, It signifies utopia. Martin Luther King's I Have a Dream. Right? For a lot of the students that we were speaking to at school, it was an exposure outside of our closed paradigm to a generation that was growing up for whom something had shifted. Right? And that was the beginning of something that we now see has become virtual common sense and is prevalent in the social media. I mean, earlier it used to be attacks on secularism and so on and so forth, and pseudo-secularism. And, the attacks had begun around 30 years ago. And now it's become kind of common sense. So what we have is a movement from one kind of nationalist common sense to a Hindu fundamentalist common sense. And while that is happening, one can't stop the conversation. If there is the destruction that is happening in central Delhi, if there is the ugly visual aesthetics of what is happening in Jallianwala Bagh, for me, what would be important is really a conversation around who is invested in this. Is nobody invested in it? Right? Or for the Sardar Patel statue, for example, that is other monstrosity. China is in fact taking down some of its gargantuan statues. Right? But there are people who seem to see this as a symbol of something. Now, how do we have a conversation about this? Because in one sense, when we think about India is a country where no conversations happen except within limited circles of caste, class, ethnicity. It's like our arranged marriages. Right? We only marry people who are like us. We won't step outside of that, and our conversations are also of that kind. So the question is, how do we have this conversation where we begin to talk about this violence with people who are committed to that violence, but who may be, in some sense, victims? Right? This is the position that Ashish Nandi took in The Intimate Enemy, that both colonizers and colonized were victims. Right? And similarly here, we have to ask who are those who are the victims of a Hindu nationalist discourse, which is premised on power, certainly, but it's also premised on ignorance. Okay?
We'll be right back after this short break.
Intel vPro provides the complete manageability tools to detect, repair, and protect your devices remotely, so your workforce can keep doing what they do best wherever they're working from. Today, as most employees and IT teams no longer work under the same roof, fixing glitchy PCs and proactively managing the PC fleet has become increasingly difficult. The Intel vPro platform addresses these problems. With its Intel Active Management technology, also known as Intel AMT, vPro enables IT to keep mission-critical resources running by establishing a secure connection between IT and an Intel vPro platform PC. In the event of a cyber attack, Intel AMT lets IT remotely manage and repair systems simultaneously, even if they are dispersed across multiple locations. PCs can be recovered quickly wherever they may be. Plus, the Intel Endpoint Management Assistant enables cloud-based manageability using simple web-based tools to connect with and remediate any Intel vPro platform PC. Both these tools provide better manageability and faster response time. This results in substantial device management support cost savings and fewer help desk tickets. Visit intel.in/IT heroes to know more. Intel vPro is built for business.
Welcome back to the Wire Talks. One of the points you said earlier interests me, and of course, one has thought about this even in the past, and it's certainly correct that left historians had one particular view, and that became the received wisdom of the time. Mm-hmm. And now this is going to be the received wisdom for a long time, disturbing as though it may be. And in fact, curiously, the current dispensation and the right wing who are saying that the reason why history has to be changed is that the left ignored Hindu contributions and negated that and rubbished it. So, in fact, when you talk about conversation, this is a conversation that never happens. Yes. Everyone talks to their own inner circle. It's preaching to the converted. When a WhatsApp comes to me, I'm aghast at some of the things it says. But a whole lot of people out there believe it. And I've seen people who are on the fence or apolitical looking at this and saying, yeah, actually, this makes sense. So the very notorious one about Motilal Nehru being actually a Muslim, and therefore everyone from then on is a Muslim, is popular opinion. One has heard these things way back when people from the Hindutva right were talking in subdued tones. It's now the other way around. So all of which you say makes a lot of sense. One, it establishes contact, but it also, in a sense, validates a point of view, and that is that history is always written by the victor. If not the victor, at least the dominant thought process of the time. So therefore, what we are seeing is a history that the current victor believes in. And therefore, this is going to remain with us forevermore till a new thought process comes.
Right. If you think about this, what you've just said, that history is written by the victor, and that history is as much about what is excluded and what is rendered silent. One of the fundamental facts of independent India and its aspiration to become modern and its recognition of itself as democratic was how it completely ignored the fact that India was founded on caste violence. Right? So starting from 1947 onwards, the killings of Dalits have continued. You could think about Kirivanmani as long back as 1968. Anand Teltumbre has given us, and Gail Ombit have given us these long histories of caste violence. And this is part of the problem right now, that even the left secular order of another time, right, starting from 1947, didn't recognize the fact of the violence that undergirded Indian society, which we're now beginning to think with. So when you think about Hindu fundamentalist violence is an extension of an inner violence that has always been present within Hinduism towards untouchables and towards its subordinate caste, which is now being extended to the Muslim. If the Dalit was not human and continues to be not human, right now that paradigm has been extended to the Muslim, which is why Ambedkar, when he was asked about this whole question of Nazism and fascism, he said, look, in India, we have systems of, he used the word emasculating large parts of the population and dealing with them with Kundain violence. Nazism and fascism have little to teach the Hindu, or little, well, one could argue little to teach India. So I think those silences are things that we need to take very seriously.
I was just saying that, all of it is very contextual and establishes some kind of historical, shall I say, backdrop.
May I just come in here? I'm asked, the fundamental question to be asked here, a very simple question, right, is, has the life of the Dalits changed dramatically with the coming of the BJP? Right? If you're an untouchable in large parts of India, life has been pretty much the same. You're regarded with contempt. You're condemned to lives of scavenging and gathering shit. Your life is worth nothing. Right? And that hasn't changed in India. Right? And in some sense, one could argue that the BJP makes its own pretense of catering to the Dalit. This is the kind of argument that Jaffrelot has been making as well, that more Dalits are being drawn to the BJP and so on. The Congress did it in its time, the BJP is doing it in its time. So there are some deep continuities in our profoundly violent, inegalitarian and hierarchical society, right? And the emergence of the BJP is a consequence of that ongoing nightmare.
So
as well.
Actually, it has been said that our founding fathers were wrong in imposing Western-style democracy on essentially a feudal country.
I don't know if I agree with that, because democracy is an imposition everywhere. We can see it falling apart in Europe. When the first Muslim enters the borders, you can see how ideas of democracy and diversity just are thrown to the winds, right? So, democracy is an attempt to live through historically an idea that is in the abstract and has different trajectories and different historical experiences everywhere. I don't know whether we can point to a country and say it's successful there. In India, it hasn't been. Right? So anyway, well,
tell me, you live in South Africa, and I must say I have a little bit of experience there.
right.
I saw the transition and the joy and the exuberance. And now, all these years later, almost 30 years later, there is disillusionment and there is violence going on. For one thing, I mean, I won't go into the details, but land was not redistributed. Right. So my point is, they had a Truth and Reconciliation
Commission, yes,
which was mixed. The success rate was mixed.
Right.
But at least there were some people who were perpetrators of the worst kind of violence who came forward and did some mea culpa. It wasn't like the what happened with the Nazis, where people were actually jailed. But and it wasn't like the Shah Commission, which was a whitewash.
Right, but nobody was jailed.
Nobody remembers the Shah Commission. Mm-hmm. Memories were revived when I read Jafrilo. But at the same time, the effort of trying to look at the past in a kind of more institutionalized manner, good, bad, whatever, and the role of, say, the historians of the past, the historians of the present, I think that is a conversation, and that's some kind of inner societal catharsis that happens, don't you think?
Yes, we do need something like that in India. In South Africa, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission has as many critics as it has supporters. A lot of people believe, and rightly so, that many were let off the hook, that the procedure was too early, too quick, that structures of white capital were left untouched. So not much has changed in South Africa in terms of ownership of land, property, and so on and so forth. And those are ongoing debates. But one instance that I'll give you, and then I'll come back to India. One instance is where a few years ago, a white lady tweeted on going to the beach in Durban, and she used a derogatory word about the black citizen who had gathered there to enjoy the sea and the sand. She was arrested, right? And coming from India, when friends asked me about this, I said, I think this is very noble, but I was very surprised because in India, people get away with saying anything that they want, that our very spaces, our so-called democratic spaces, universities, hospitals, courtrooms, are characterized by a vocabulary of contempt towards large sections of the population. You think about the numbers of suicides that happen in IITs and so on and so forth. So I think we need something, while we are constantly fixated on the idea of colonialism, right, and what it did to India, what we did to each other is what we now need to engage with. And what we continue to do to each other is what we need to engage with. We need something like the Truth and Reconciliation Commission with regard to caste, right? I mean, how is it that 70 years after independence, we can still have a matrimonial advertisement page in every major newspaper which specifies patriarchy, which specifies caste, which specifies color, every possible inequity which distinguishes humans from one another is there on display, and it's taken for granted. It's part of the fabric of who we are. So I think
that actually is quite interesting. You should say that, because in strictest terms, it is illegal.
Yes,
it's just not unethical or bad form, but it's illegal, and yet they make a lot of money. And if you ask them, they'll say that, well, this is what the market demands. And that again is a classic example of society having its own trajectory, while the state says something entirely different. So what is all this when you see whether micro level aggression like renaming of a city,
right,
and telling us that Rana Pratap actually did not lose in Haldighati.
That's right. Yes.
And in fact, also the role of popular culture, movies being made which kind of distort history left, right, and center, Panipat and all that. That's at one end. And the other end is what you mentioned right up front, is the ambience in which this is happening, the lynchings, the changes in the law, very, very, very critical.
That's right.
Where you are rendering, almost 180 million people or something like that stateless, if they get their way. What does all this mean, and where is it taking us as a country?
No, it's the old Gramscian idea that the period of the interregnum produces monsters, and we are going through a very trying and horrible time in India, because an older paradigm has shifted. And an older paradigm with its own silences and violence, both, as I've been saying, is shifted, and a new paradigm is in place. And now there will have to be a reaction to this, which will be hopefully not a very long time coming, but it might be a long time coming, because remember that we lived for 70 years within a society which accorded no value to Dalit life. 70 years, right? And that fact continues in contemporary India. So when one thinks about what the BJP is doing in terms of its attempts to transform the ways in which people think about themselves as human beings, ways in which people think about society, about politics, and so on, it's going to produce, hopefully, a series of reactions, but those reactions which have to be engaged with this. Because very often, as you and I know, people see this as a mere aberration. The BJP is not an aberration. It's a natural outgrowth of the contradictions and the unspoken and unaddressed problems and violence in Indian society. It's a manifestation of all of that. So in that sense, it's both natural as well as historical, right? That it is wrong, that it profoundly devalues qualities like truth, that it devalues certain lives, is abhorrent. But I think we must not dismiss it as an aberration. Once we have done that, we have lost not only the argument, we have lost a way of thinking about the present.
Actually, this final point that you made is, a good way to see a lot of things that it has been my argument in many places that I write, that Mr. Modi and the BJP are the voice of a lot of Indians at the moment, because he is not representing them, but he is them.
Mm-hmm.
And they see themselves there, that their own sense of resentment, grievance, and being left behind, though of course many of them are from the elite, and being left behind and ignored by the other elite, is now coming, they can say whatever they've been suppressing all this while, and they can exhale now and say at a social occasion of friends and people like them that these people are getting out of hand.
Mm-hmm.
And we know what you mean by these people, because he says so, that they need to be put in their place. So in fact, I think it is not an aberration. I know it's not an aberration. It's a projection of their most inner desires. So one understands all this. I think it was I who asked you to give a remote view. I am sitting in Bombay, looking at what's happening and feeling a little appalled, because it's invading my sensibility. So thank you. It provides us a way of looking at things which is not just contextual, but also larger, that perhaps maybe some of the historians here should also look at, so that they can get down to the business of, that recently there was an attempt to shut out a speaker or a course in one of the universities. And people have argued that shutting out a course on Savarkar or something, even if it's for MA, is wrong, because you might get all kinds of opinions and they should be addressed. So, many ways of looking at the same thing. There is a liberal view and there is a narrow ideological one. So with that, thank you very much, Dilip Menon, for giving us this broad understanding of how we should be looking at everyday events. And getting to know why these things are happening rather than just merely agitating over each one individually.
Right.
So thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you, Sidharth. And so long as we remember that India has been for a long time a violent, inegalitarian, and hierarchical society, that ought to provide the clarity for thinking about the future.
Okay. So that was Dilip Menon, Professor of South Asian History at the University of Witwatersrand in Johannesburg, South Africa, and a deeply engaged thinker and writer on modern India, talking to us about how history is being redone and what exactly does it mean in the atmosphere of the past, the present, and the future. We'll be back again next week with another guest on the Wire Talks. Meanwhile, it's bye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and my guests. You can check out this podcast and other interesting ones on the Wire website, the IVM Podcast website, app, or wherever else that you get your podcasts. Goodbye from me, Sidharth Bhatia, and the Wire Talks podcast team.
Hi everybody, just wanted to ask everyone for a quick favor. We're running a brand survey right now and would really appreciate it if you could let us know what you think about the advertising on IVM. Go to ivmpodcast.com/survey and do let us know. As part of this, we'll be selecting 10 random participants and sending them some IVM swag, so do fill out those surveys. Hey everybody, it's been a great week on the IVM Podcast Network. On The Longest Constitution, Priya narrates the long and ongoing battle of striking down Section 9 of the Hindu Marriage Act of 1955. That allows one party to appeal to the courts to restore his or her conjugal acts, and has unsurprisingly been used more by men than women. On Press Decode, Bhagda, Ragini, Sarah, and Adya talk about the inspiration behind the movie Hotel Rwanda. Venkatesh Saha, head of APAC and Middle East expansion at WISE, joins Anupam on Pesa to talk about foreign exchange services. And on the Life Manifesto, Zarina explains the difference between personality and personal brand. Do follow us on social media. We're IVM Podcast on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And remember, if you're enjoying this show or any of our other shows for that matter, please do tell a friend. It really does help us. And finally, we'd like to thank our sponsors on the network this week, Cred, Bank of Baroda, Quota, CoinSwitch, Kuber, and Inter vPro. Thank you so much for making this possible.